Our next major topic in the class is cartography, or as it's presented here, basic principles of map design. Um, the things that you've been exposed to so far have been looking at the different data models that we have, some of the fundamentals of GIS work, ideas about data quality, how to handle coordinate systems, what they mean. And so cartography is pulling all of those different things together and forming a functional map, something that you're probably very familiar with, having used them all of your life in one form or another. But now we're going to start getting at the principles that go behind making good map products and using maps as a form of visual communication between you, the GIS analyst, or the organization you're working for, and your audience, whoever that might be. So the process is an iterative process. You begin with an idea, you've got an objective, something that you're trying to accomplish, and we go through these various stages of map design as our textbook is presenting them. Um, and you may find that at some point in this process that something's gone wrong, you don't like how your map is looking, you don't like the choices that you've made regarding color or the type of symbols or even how you calculated your information and analyzed it in the first place. And you may go back a step or two, and you may go back several steps and then redo work, come back, maybe even wind up with a finished map product. And then in the end, decide, that just didn't work well. Let's go back and again take a couple steps back and redo it. So think of this as an ongoing process, and a map is something that, eventually it's done. It's going to be something that's completed and ready for people to use. But you may discover, as you continue working in the field of GIS analysis and cartography, you learn new techniques and you go back and look at your older maps and say, I could have done that just a little bit differently if I'd used this technique that I learned last week, that sort of a thing. It's something that we can learn fundamentals, but we may never truly be masters of the art of cartography, but we can certainly give it a good try and make the best map product possible by going through these steps that are outlined in our textbook and in many other textbooks. So the first thing, why are we doing this in the first place? So why are we making a map? What's the point? Instead of some other type of data portrayal or data visualization, maps are a distinctive form of visual communication, and we use them to display things, as we've seen and as you already know, across space. And so they are something that's somewhat unique in the field of graphic design, in that we're pulling information about the landscape together into some usually two-dimensional form, and that's the medium we're going to be focusing on here is going to be two-dimensional maps. So Price is giving us these four things to think about, four key questions. What's the purpose? Why are we doing the map in the first place? Who's the audience? Who's actually going to be viewing the map and therefore needing to understand it, needing to interpret it? Do they have any special needs? Do they have any special desires? Those types of things. What medium are we going to be using? Most of the time, it's going to be two-dimensional on a piece of paper, or a poster, something printed in a book, perhaps displayed on a web page. And under what conditions will it be viewed? Again, what's the medium? That relates right back into that. Is it a printed or a virtual type of a map? And there are a lot of variations that we can do, even using two-dimensional maps. We can do time series of maps, what we call animated maps, where they show change across time and space. We can do 3D visualizations of terrain shown in two dimensions on the computer screen or on a printed map. But overall, what this slide is getting at is we need to know why we're doing this thing. Why are we going through the analysis in the first place? And at some point in time, the analysis dictates that the way we communicate the results of the analysis is going to be a map. And so we're going to try to make the best map product we can using a variety of different techniques and little tricks to make it easy to read, easy to understand, and visually interesting. So, as you know, from growing up and using maps all your life from childhood into adulthood, we use maps for a lot of things. They're all showing phenomena across space, so they're inherently spatial. We use them for basic location, knowing where cities, mountain ranges, rivers, all the classic ideas of what geography is, boils down to just basic location. Related to that, navigating between locations on a street network, doing on a hike or a hunt, being able to know how to get from place to place easily, or understanding the terrain, as the list implies here. Also, compiling lots of information. We can put together many different forms of information and display them all at once on a map. And if you're trained in reading particular kinds of maps, especially the specialized ones, like the one in the upper right, a geological map that shows a lot of information about geological structures, rock unit types, past geologic events. If you're familiar with what the map symbols are, that map tells us a lot of detail about that particular location. We can use, related to that idea, then analyzing space. We can not only depict what's on the landscape, but we can analyze by putting together a lot of these different pieces of information. Analyze the landscape, analyze space, and get a handle on what's happening there, especially over time. Looking at the image on the upper left is an example of satellite maps showing the Aral Sea and desertification processes. On the left-hand side of that diagram, in the year 2000, there was a lot more water in the Aral Sea. Desertification processes have been ongoing for quite a while, as it is showing since 1960 at least. And on the right-hand side of the diagram, 2009, the Aral Sea has shrunk quite a bit. So we can simply visually analyze space. We can also analyze multiple different data sets simultaneously, which is what you're learning in the exercises in the class and the practicals. And comparing places, comparing information sources, comparing what's going on in different locations. Again, maps are being inherently spatial. They're just perfect for these purposes. Where we see them in the news quite often, convincing people of one position or another on some spatially related issue. Maps get used all the time for that. Think about polls during a presidential election cycle, where they show polls by county, polls by state, how many people support one candidate or another. Maps often appear in the news in those contexts, and also for understanding events that are happening in the news, like the natural disasters, the location where it was occurring, how it occurred, what happened, how much devastation there was afterwards. We use maps as a form of visual communication, and is a very powerful form of visual communication. We're able to quickly display and understand and comprehend a lot of information just by consuming, basically, with our eyes, the information that's in a map. So our audience can vary quite a bit, and we don't always know who's going to be seeing the map. Sometimes we can design a map specifically for an audience. We know their characteristics, we know what they're looking for, we understand what kind of information they want to have about the Earth's surface, and so we can specifically design something for them. Sometimes we don't know a whole lot about our audience. We don't know what their education level is. We don't know what their political leanings might be, or their belief systems, or things like that, that might interpret or might influence how they interpret what's displayed on a map. Um, we also don't have any idea how sophisticated they are in terms of understanding what's actually shown on a map and the way that we choose to depict it. Are they going to be able to understand it? And another, one of the more obvious characteristics that comes to mind when you start getting serious about map design and graphic design is your audience able to actually sense the different forms of color that you use? Are they colorblind in one way or another? And can we design around that? Do we have to design around that? So those are kind of characteristics that you need to think about when you're making a map. If it's a general purpose map, who's it for? How are they going to use it? Does that influence the choices that you make in terms of what you choose to depict on the map, how you choose to depict it on the map, what even something as simple as what map projection do you use, what's most appropriate, the color scheme that you're using, patterns, symbol types, all of those choices may depend upon the characteristics of your audience, and especially their education level is very critical. Sometimes cultural issues come into play, especially with color. Certain colors you might want to avoid if they're associated with bad connotations. For example, black, often associated with death, is something that you may want to choose to avoid. If you're designing maps, it'll be used in certain countries where black is traditionally avoided unless you're talking about funeral arrangements for someone or something like that. So anyway, this is something now, maps, with you being the producer of a map, it's something you need to worry about a little bit, is thinking about your audience and how your work is going to be received by them. Our medium, these days, can be a little bit more complex. In the past, primarily we were interested in creating maps that would be printed out either on standard paper or a poster, a leaflet, something even larger, a banner. But nowadays, with the rise of personal computing and the internet, there's a lot of maps that never see print. They're just produced and displayed on computer screens, and that's the only way they get consumed. And they may be, then your concerns are going to be in part map design, but also what file type do I export my map into for the best possible viewing on an electronic screen. What size of a screen? Is it going to be a tablet, a phone, a 55-inch TV at home? What are we going to be seeing this thing on? So medium is something that's become a little bit more fluid these days. And if you're creating maps for public consumption, you may be creating something that needs to be able to be viewed on all of those devices at once, in which case you may need special software that creates multiple copies of the same thing at different resolutions behind your back and displays them to those people as they need them. That is a topic for another course. But here we're going to be focusing on basic principles of cartographic design as if we were going to be printing them statically on some large format paper, or you're making an electronic file to share, like something that would be included in a report. And that's the approach that we're going to take in this course. Well, let's take up that idea just a little bit about if we were designing maps for display on paper versus on the internet. Over on the left, we'll do that first for paper maps. Especially when you create one of these things, it's static and unchanging. When you print it, that's what it is. It doesn't really alter unless you go in, revise it, and print it again. It's going to be a fixed size depending upon what you printed it on, a regular sheet of paper or a poster size sheet of paper. And at that scale, the information can be very high resolution. Printing, especially with a large format paper and small pixel sizes, you can get a lot of detail into a printed map. We can display lots of different kinds of information, make the map very complex and heavy with content, but we can still make it easy to read. In general, people who are consulting paper maps, they're committed to getting something out of that map. They need information, and they're going to be willing to sit and sift through that information a little bit to get what they need out of it. And therefore, the map can be something designed for conveying multiple pieces of information simultaneously, and it can be used for many different purposes. Conversely, web maps, they tend to be a little bit more interactive. Think of Google Maps, even Google Earth these days. Your viewing size may vary depending upon how you're looking at it. Using a computer, using a tablet, your phone. Perhaps if you're technologically advanced, maybe your wristwatch. You're viewing things there and using the internet through your wristwatch. Our web maps are going to be subjected to people using them outdoors, where they constantly are consulting their phones these days. So you have to worry about lighting conditions and how that influences the color choices and symbol choices that you make on your map, how it's being displayed on a screen that's relatively small and getting washed out by sunlight. Your viewer on the web typically has a short attention span. To use the title of an old TV show, short attention span theater. You've got a short amount of time to get that information across. And you're competing with that person being your audience is probably getting ready to move on to something else. So your map should do one thing very well and focus on doing that one thing very well in order to get it across. And that may mean that you need to have a series of maps to explain something rather than one single printed map that could do all of those tasks at once. So these are some ideas that when we get into interactive web cartography, we need to start thinking about, which are very different in some ways than what we need to consider when we're doing paper maps. Fundamentally, however, creating all of a single map all boils down to the same principles. So whether we're designing for print, interactive web-based maps, or whatever, animated maps, some of the principles are always going to apply. Principles that are grounded very heavily in cartographic theory, of sensation and perception, and just basic graphic design. And so let's start getting into some of those ideas. Okay, here we transition on our overall map production process, our map design process, and we start examining selection processes. So what are we selecting to use, to display, to analyze, to meet our map objective? First thing we need to do is figure out what kind of data we're going to need. We may be doing an analysis, and that analysis may be very dry, in some cases kind of challenging. But in the end, we need to display that information in a way that's very much like storytelling. So we can select the data that we're going to display in the map that best tells the story. And if there's information, data sets, for example, that don't really add much to the story or detract from the story, we may decide to eliminate those data sets from the overall map design process. So as you're working through an analysis, a research protocol, some sort of series of questions that you're answering using your GIS data sets, one thing you should have in the back of your mind is, how is this going to play out when I create the map that summarizes all of it, how am I best going to be able to show this information? And by getting into the information and understanding what it is through the analytical process, you will be better able to decide, okay, which of these pieces of information is best going to get across the points that need to be emphasized, that are the whole reason why we're making the map in the first place.